This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 260 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the new FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I got a ton of questions this week, so I'm going to get to them right away today. Well, I will after I tell you to head on over to NumberFire.com and check out the NFL Draft Kit. You can get rankings from me and my colleagues Brandon Gadula and Jim Sanas. You can get projections and auction values from NumberFire's algorithm, and you can customize the draft kit to fit your league settings to make sure that you're drafting a baller team with NumberFire's analytics. So sign up for NumberFire Premium and start your journey to a fantasy football championship today. This first mailbag question is from @DollEMJV on Twitter. How do you employ the late round quarterback strategy in leagues where quarterbacks are taken, including backups, extremely early? I get this question all the time. The quick answer is you have to adjust. The late round quarterback strategy, as I noted just last week, it's not just about a game of chicken. It's about a game of value. And value is generally extracted in the late rounds of single quarterback leagues. I'm not saying that you're doing this here, but almost always when I get this question, people are overstating the tendency for their league to get quarterbacks early. And honestly, if teams are taking quarterbacks that early in your drafts, then that just means that you're gobbling up insane value at the more important positions in fantasy football. But if you're in an unpredictable league like this, my process would be as follows. Have a list of quarterbacks you'd be cool starting at the beginning of the season. If you know your league is drafting backups and you're afraid that the waiver wire is going to suck so you can't stream, then feel free to have in your mind that you're going to take two quarterbacks. Now, as the draft goes on, be reactive. When you start to see your list get down to just 4 or 5 guys since teams are drafting backups, take your first quarterback. Not only is that player still going to be usable, but I can almost guarantee you that that selection is going to be much later than you think. And all the while, your running backs and wide receivers are going to be absolutely awesome. This next question is from @FFZinger. What is your general strategy for best utilizing the last few spots on your roster, especially in leagues with 20 or more spots? Do you specifically target one position, true handcuffs, or players who would emerge without an injury? So I think targeting running backs is going to be more fruitful than targeting wide receivers here. We know they get hurt at a higher rate, and we also know that there's an easier path to them to see volume with an injury than at wide receiver. There's a reason people go 0 RB. And there's a reason handcuffing running backs is a thing while handcuffing wide receivers isn't. Now, I don't advocate that you handcuff running backs in most formats. If the rosters are deep, though, it does make more sense. But it's usually a wasted roster spot. I did a study on it a couple of years back, and I actually have an evergreen episode on the topic, which is episode 20. So if you want to learn why handcuffing running backs is usually a waste, listen to that one. But in a deeper league where you're throwing darts, I'm not against handcuffing. I'm not totally against the idea. I'm also not against just targeting players deeper on depth charts who have question marks ahead of them. Now, a good example of this is Green Bay and their wide receivers. I'd put money on Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Geronimo Allison seeing the field more than Equanimeous St. Brown this year. But it's not a guarantee. Who knows what happens in camp and in the preseason? So I'll throw a dart at a player like that, like Equanimeous St. Brown, who still has a chance to emerge without an injury. Running backs are usually my first dart, and then the ESB type players. That's generally how I handle the last spots with large rosters. This next question is from @FantasySportsB2. Chances that Lamar Jackson puts it all together sooner than expected and has peak Michael Vick type season. I think Lamar Jackson is the best late round quarterback this season in single quarterback leagues. You have to ignore floor when you're targeting your quarterback. Shoot for ceiling when you know that your worst case scenario is quarterback streaming. And again, this is in most leagues. But Lamar Jackson has an opportunity to break fantasy football. When he took over as starter last year through the fantasy playoffs, he averaged 17.4 points per game, but he never scored below 15.7 points in the standard league. Now, quite simply, imagine a world where he progresses after being a rookie, where his passing improves, and where the Ravens still go as run heavy as they did last year. All of a sudden, Lamar Jackson has insane upside. Do I think that's all probable? No, I don't think it's probable. The Ravens will likely be more pass heavy due to natural regression. Jackson is highly unlikely to run at the rate that he did last year, and there's a chance that he just isn't that good of a passer. One of those things can easily happen. But that doesn't mean I'm not buying the ceiling. I'm buying the ceiling for Lamar Jackson. That's what you've got to do with your late round quarterback targets. This next question is from @DreamAssembler. How do you value the Cardinals, a team with a new coach with a lot of hype to revamp the offense, but without any NFL experience? It seems like we're assuming the Cardinals will be productive almost based on a Sean McVay effect or something. How can we trust the Cardinals? I'm not sure we're assuming that the Cardinals are going to be that productive when you consider the average draft positions of their players. The only guy going high in drafts right now is David Johnson. If the expectation was that the Cardinals would be as good or as efficient as a Sean McVay run team, then Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald's ADPs would be a couple of rounds higher, at least. You're trusting the Cardinals offense for a few reasons this year. The first is volume. Cliff Kingsbury consistently coached his teams in college to top 10 plays run per game rates. When you run at a fast pace, more plays are run, and when more plays are run, players in that offense compile flashier statistics. You're also buying into Kyler Murray, who's one of the most efficient college quarterbacks that we've ever seen, and he's someone who fits the offense. There's an upgrade at quarterback in Arizona. But when you combine those things, you're buying into upside. Just because we haven't seen these things happen in Arizona doesn't mean that they won't happen. I'm definitely a believer that people and things in football get hyped all the time. People love to exaggerate when talking sports and football in particular. A lot of times, those things don't have a direct impact on fantasy football, objectively. Something like how big of a locker room cancer some player is, I don't care about that. We don't have any way of knowing how true stories like that are, let alone the impact that would have on a football field. With what we know about Kingsbury and the Cardinals, the things that are happening in Arizona right now, those things directly relate to fantasy football because those things are about pace and volume. And since the cost of these players, aside from David Johnson, they don't include a very high opportunity cost. In other words, if Christian Kirk or Larry Fitzgerald or Kyler Murray bust this season, it's not sinking your fantasy football team. So there's little reason to just fade this offense because of what might be looked at as outlandish expectations. So to answer your question more directly, you're trusting the Cardinals offense because upside does exist with it. But more importantly, trusting the offense won't destroy your fantasy team. This next question is from @mad_park44. What is more important to a running back's total production, an elite quarterback or an elite offensive line? In the case of Le'Veon Bell, did the offensive line or Big Ben matter more? If Darnold plays great, but the offensive line is a downgrade like we expect, what does that mean for Bell? Are PFF grades the best metric to use? I won't lie here, you guys. This question made my head explode. I sat there thinking about this for like an hour the other day. I was changing my notes constantly because there are so many layers to it, like so many. And here's what I concluded. I don't have an answer for this because I don't think that you can have an answer for this. There's going to be some correlation between having a good offensive line and having elite quarterback efficiency. Offensive line play will help a quarterback, so that makes this hypothetical kind of irrelevant. And I'd argue that even if you knew which one was more important, the application is also really difficult. You have to then project and predict what that means. Offensive line play is hard to project. Even quarterback play to a degree is hard to project. And both of these things aren't necessarily volume-based, or they're not volume-based the same way that other running back variables are, like scheme or offensive play calling, or whether the back is going to see a huge rushing share and a target share in his offense. Those things are far more important for a running back in fantasy football. Like I said, I think this hypothetical is just kind of irrelevant. Those things are going to correlate in some way. Both of those things are going to matter in some way. But there are so many specifics to a player's situation that you're never going to get a clean answer for something like this. And even if you had an answer, it would be really difficult to apply those learnings. So I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer for this. But I don't think I've spent more time thinking about a mailbag question in my entire life. So congratulations on that. This next question is from @JaredHyde10. With Andy Reid calling Damian Williams the full-time starter, how isn't he a first-round lock? Including the playoffs, he had 10 touchdowns in 6 games while averaging workhorse 17.5 touches. Damian Williams has that type of ceiling. I've said this from the start of the offseason. Damian Williams absolutely has a top 5 running back ceiling in fantasy football. The hesitation, and I think it's valid, is that Damian Williams is 27 years old, and he's yet to really have a worthwhile season from a production standpoint. We don't see situations like this happen very often, and that makes it risky. I think he's a good buy at his ADP though, because the risk is sort of embedded in that cost given the reward. And I think it's likely that we see Damian Williams thrive in this offense. Not to be one of those dudes that's like, I've been saying this for months, but I've been saying this for months. When the Chiefs signed Carlos Hyde, it was a good thing because they then didn't invest in the position during the draft. And Carlos Hyde isn't a special running back. He's not a bad late round dart throw this year, but he's not a special running back. He's not some running back who's obviously better than Damian Williams. So I think Williams' ADP makes a lot of sense right now. Some think it's way too high. Others, like you, Jared, think that it's way too low. But I think it actually combines his floor-ceiling combo pretty well. This next question is from @DreSpinney. Do you recommend late-round quarterback drafting for dynasty startups? Yes, I do. The same concepts apply in single quarterback dynasty leagues. You just will need more than one rostered since teams are larger. But you can use the same streaming ideas when setting your lineup each week. Instead of the waiver wire, you're using your bench and playing by matchup. I would actually argue it's more exploitable in Dynasty because people think that they need longevity from the position in that type of format. But yes, I recommend a late round quarterback strategy in startups, at least in single quarterback ones. This next question is from @MattD213. Who are your favorite late round quarterbacks to target at their current ADPs right now? It's a 2-quarterback league or else I would stream. Thanks. So I think it's important to first listen to episode 139 of the show to get my take on Superflex and 2-quarterback strategy, because it's going to be different than your typical fantasy league. But the actual choices that you make in 2-quarterback leagues, those should be different too. Like in a single quarterback league, you should be looking strictly at upside. Like I said earlier, I'm looking at Lamar Jackson. That's all you want. You just want upside. In a 2-quarterback league, you still have to worry about floor, because if one of your quarterbacks bust, you actually are losing a significant part of your team. So you have to look at strong floor ceiling guys who are being drafted later. I tend to gravitate towards Dak Prescott as my QB1 in that type of format, and then I try to get a couple of guys who should have their starting jobs throughout the season. So maybe Andy Dalton, Derek Carr, Matthew Stafford, just lower tiered options who you can play by matchup. That's how I would approach a 2-quarterback league draft in 2019. This next question is from @DaveShepke. How do you calculate estimated targets lost in an offense? For example, with the Steelers, we know how many targets are being left on the table with AB leaving, but do you factor in Big Ben being a year older? How does this affect Juju and, say, Vance's stock? Yeah, so this is really just a question about projections and how those are built. I go with a top-down approach. So I look at team-level projections, so figuring out how many plays a team is going to run, how many of those plays are going to be passes, how many will be rushes, and so on. And then you can divvy up that via target share and rushing share. So with the Steelers, they were really, really pass-heavy last year. They were one of the most pass-heavy teams that we've seen over the last decade. There will be some natural regression there. So we can expect them to probably be a little bit more run-heavy here in 2019. And then you add in the fact that Antonio Brown's no longer there, and we'll likely see some more runs in neutral game scripts. So you get a pass attempt number by doing this. My team level projections have the Steelers at 638 pass attempts this year. That's still a lot, but it's not where they were last year. But from there, you divvy up target share based on player history, how you see the offense breaking down, coordinator history, competition, and so on. So you're assigning target shares to these players, and it's really an educated guess. You're not blindly making these target shares, but there's some subjectivity to the process. So to your question about how you handle vacated targets, it all comes together in a projection. There's no AB when you're building out the Steelers' projections for 2019, so you don't have to worry about them. You just will see a natural bump in target share to certain players, and you'll see differences among analysts with how they distributed those targets. Because your projection is not a certainty. Like I said, it's an educated guess. Some people may think, based on evidence, that James Washington deserves the biggest bump in target share. Some think that it's Dante Moncrief. Some think it's Vance McDonald. But it all comes together in a projection. And by the way, this is why I think the process of building projections is more important than the projection itself. Because you're able to see a path to upside for a lot of these players. You're able to say, what happens if this guy actually sees a lot higher target share than I'm currently projecting him for? And that story allows you to better spot breakouts and values in your fantasy draft. This last question is from @MrDayCarry. You do a fantastic job of educating us in how to spot value ahead of the curve. I love the show. Thank you. But can you apply the same methods to spotting when a player is going to start dropping off mid-season, or is that more of a film watching thing? Yeah, so if I'm understanding this question correctly, I do this throughout the season in my 15 transactions column and podcast. You're looking at players who are sell candidates, and it's usually based on unsustainable production and general regression. So a lot of my sell candidates are going to be players who have gotten lucky, that their numbers are just not sustainable, so you're going to sell them to another team. So really, it's not different than looking at what I looked at in my negative regression podcast that I recently did. It's just that instead of using season-long stats that are finished, you're looking at in-season stats. And those numbers are generally a lot crazier too because the sample size is smaller. You're talking 6 or 7 or 8 games instead of a full 16. So with a smaller sample size, there's more variance. There's going to be some crazier things happening when you're looking at regression. So that's how you can spot guys who are going to drop off midseason, at least from a data perspective. And for the record, not that you thought this when you were writing your question, but I watch football, you guys. I enjoy watching film. I just am better at the data side and explaining the data side. And I think it's more important for fantasy purposes because fantasy football, in the end, is a game about numbers. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. I guess I should say Apple Podcasts and not iTunes, so go to Apple Podcasts. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. You can also find me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Hope you all have a great weekend.